start straight away. My name's Max. Pleasure to have you here. I'm honored and delighted to host this great panel today on DeFi, bridging the gap between DeFi and regulators. With me, we have Jon Isaksen from Uniswap. We have Alain from EBA. We have Mark, CEO from Banker, and we have Thomas, who's attorney at law and also one of my colleagues at INATBA and chair of INATBA, the International Association for Trusted Blockchain Applications. So, the topic, bridging the gap between DeFi and regulators. One of the hottest topics we have at the moment. A lot of discussions being led about MiCA and also exemptions from MiCA. In one of the recitals, it says that MiCA shouldn't apply to fully decentralized applications and systems. So, what does this mean? And maybe my first question to one of the actual co-authors of MiCA, who's now with Uniswap Labs. Jon, please elaborate on this.
Okay, yes, I think that's a topic we cannot avoid with this title of the panel. I think to Max's point, what I've been doing ever since I left the European Commission and making the rounds in Europe, speaking to anyone from regulators to legislators, is of course that why does it say fully decentralized? What is the meaning of this recital? And what exactly is within scope and outside of scope? What is actually fully decentralized? And I think an easy way to look at it, which I think most people tend to agree with, is that there is one discussion which is more about the definition or qualification of an interface, which is something within Title V of MiCA. Do you perform one of the activities by a centralized entity? And then when it comes to the protocol level, often the question is, when is a protocol actually decentralized? Now, of course, I can come with the reasons why I believe we wrote MiCA the way we did. But the fact of the matter is that there is not really any agreed upon definition. So putting anything into legal text as in XYZ means you are fully decentralized wasn't really an option. And MiCA, as most of the people who know it will recognize, is very much traditional in the sense that it focuses on intermediaries. It basically just extends the scope of financial regulation to a new asset class and new issuers. But it doesn't really go into the question of when something is actually decentralized. It basically was created during the time when everyone from international standard setters to others started coming up with this Dino approach, saying, well, decentralized in name only, which is my MiCA clearly states, well, if part of the operation of the activity that is in scope of MiCA is performed by a centralized entity, then it should apply. But it doesn't say anything about new types of intermediaries or extending the scope of MiCA beyond what is in Title V, which is custody, exchange, trading, all that stuff that we know from traditional financial markets.
Thank you very much, Jon. We have someone here from the European Banking Authority that might have a different opinion about this. So I would like to hand over to you, Alain. What's your take on MiCA and its application to decentralized finance?
Hi. Do you listen? Yeah? Okay, so Jon was right that there's this recital in MiCA saying that if a service is fully decentralized or the issuance of a token is fully decentralized, then it is not covered by MiCA. But at the same time, fully decentralized or decentralization is not a concept that is defined in MiCA. And at the same time, when the crypto sector uses this term, it always means something different. And this is something that for us, it's very relevant. Like, we always have to look at each case, and we go case by case, and we don't necessarily take the words and the even apparent qualification used by the industry as our own qualification. You know, like, we have to go case by case. In the case of MiCA, I think it's also relevant to understand that it requires providers of crypto asset services as well to apply all the rules that they are required under MiCA when they offer services on tokens that have been issued in a DeFi way or decentralized way. So the requirement would not apply to a fully decentralized issuer or CASP, but if there is a centralized CASP offering services on a DeFi token, then certain rules apply. So it's not like DeFi is completely out of MiCA or out of regulation. So that's I would think this is the key to understand.
Yes, thank you very much, Alain. I think it's a great take on this. I mean, a lot of discussions are being led about what even is fully decentralized, right? It means, I think, right from the get-go, there is nothing fully decentralized. It's a progress, step by step, and something can develop into. And the question at this moment is, what is sufficiently decentralized? Mark, from practice, something we have been discussing quite a lot as well is responsibility and liability in the decentralized world. So ultimately the question arises, if something goes wrong, who can be held responsible? We want someone that we hold a claim against. We want someone that we say, oh, she was the one being responsible for this collapse. So how should this be handled in your view? And do you think it would make sense to have a developer or interface liability responsibility?
Yeah, there's a little to unpack here. So I think in the context of the discussion that we were just having, I think that it's interesting to see the regulators in the industry sort of converging on this idea of decentralization, because just from a historical context, it was not necessarily that the industry is going to be decentralized for its own sake, but that you can, in a way, be such a vague moving target for regulators that there is no way to regulate it, right? And this is kind of where blockchain and DeFi was born from. It wasn't there is a legal definition of decentralization or sufficient decentralization that we're going after, and it is by that measure that we are going to, fit into this legal structure. And so for regulators to now sort of be approaching and say, well, if something is sufficiently decentralized and actually giving it a legal definition is kind of strange. It's sort of like art imitating life in a way, because it wasn't, it was never this sort of standard that we're holding ourselves to for any, for its own sake. It was pragmatic in that sense. With the liability thing, I think it's important to see it through that same lens. When something is sufficiently decentralized, there should be no one that you can literally hold up and say, this was your decision to do this, and therefore you are accountable for the consequences, any more than you can say that a cultural movement, for example, can be attributed to someone and whatever consequences that it might result in. And of course, there are examples that we can point to where something is just an emergent property of the people that are participating in a system. And within that sort of vein, you can't say that there is one person to which we hold account. And I think that this should be the ideal in DeFi. Of course, as you've said, there's usually at least a group of people in the beginning who get the ball rolling in the start. But there is also a very strong pattern of then sort of giving responsibility of the protocol and its operations to the community members who control it. And even then, you have the issue of, well, if someone writes a proposal and that proposal is accepted and that has an adverse consequence, should they be held accountable for the decisions that they're made? I think that there is a convenient line in the sand, which is that it's almost obvious when someone was the person to whom you can attribute something bad happening, whether it be like widespread fraud in the case of people like Do Kwon, for example, or when someone deliberately introduces a malicious piece of code or something into the protocol in order to exploit users or something like that. But then there can also just be people rallying behind a bad idea like liquidity mining, for example, which can then have a devastating consequence on the on the economy of that token or the protocol that it's that's dependent on it. And under those situations, it is, and I have been in this situation myself, very difficult to say this is the person who decided that liquidity mining was going to be the thing, and so it is their responsibility to pay for the consequences, because it wasn't that way at all. It was an emergent cultural phenomenon in much the same way that a lot of things that large communities gather behind. And so I think that there are cases where it is clear, and I don't mind saying that this is an individual who made a bad decision and we should hold them to account. But that doesn't mean that we should always try to do that. There will be situations where sometimes bad things happen, and it was the crowd wisdom or lack thereof that caused it. And just the same way that in DeFi and in blockchains in general, the idea was to be decentralized in the sense that you cannot hold one person to account, there are going to be those situations today where things go wrong, and it was the decision of the many that caused it, and you can't hold a group like that is so ill-defined to account in any legal sense.
Thank you very much, Mark. Great input there. Also, with regards looking to practice of stories like Tornado Cash, right, where someone developed an idea of protecting privacy, and afterwards it's used for money laundering. Can I hold this person accountable for this?
Yeah.
Yes or no?
There's, would you hold someone to account that, for example, left a loaded weapon in a room with small children, right? Like DeFi is, I apologize for the turn of phrase, but is mostly populated by children. And to give them something that is so easily weaponizable, like Tornado Cash, was probably something that you should, even as a developer, just wonder if this is a good decision. And I don't, for the record, I actually don't hold the Tornado Cash developers to account. I think that they are privacy maximalists, then there is a legitimate argument for the existence of these types of protocols. But you can also understand the counter argument, right? If you are a taxation agency or someone who is committed to anti-terrorism financing, then something like this is obviously offensive, on a personal level, but then also obviously incompatible with traditional financial laws. And so under that premise, I would say that there are a lot of things where people, end up martyring themselves for something that they believe in that is so obviously, incompatible with the world. And Tornado Cash is probably a good example of that. So I think that we can hold someone to account because we have. You can identify the person whose idea it was, who implemented it, that then resulted in a large, money laundering ring. But does that mean that they are ethically? If I think that they did something unethical, I'm not entirely sure. But legally, I think it's easy to make a decision.
Yep. Thank you, Mark. Maybe taking also away from your answer and then handing over to Thomas. We have existing regulation, and sometimes this existing regulation applies to new developments, such as decentralized finance. Sometimes we say we can put this into existing boxes. Sometimes we have to create new regulation. What rules should be applied to those platforms and applications where existing regulation may not apply? And also maybe taking something from what Mark said, in decentralized finance, should we focus on a top-down regulation approach or rather expect the market to create regulation bottom-up?
Thank you for that question. I think it's, if you want to go a step back, and whenever I talk to regulators, and I had the honor to be in several work groups already, I think the right approach is to first understand what we are dealing with, right? And that's the first step. And it's now in Europe, at least, and in a lot of countries, you have very well, people who really understand the technology. That was not the case years ago. And for me, that's my personal opinion. I think if we would have something which is really fully decentralized, which we don't have in 99 whatever %, right? Then the question is, where would you really need regulation? So give you a very small, easy example. If you operate the DEX, it's really a fully decentralized exchange which addresses the risks properly, which we normally address in the centralized world with regulation. like nobody can front run your orders, nobody can place fake orders. All of that stuff is addressed. In the end, there will be no harm because people get the outcome they expect, right? The system will do what we expect from the system it should do. So then the question is, where do we need regulation? Then everybody comes up with the question, yeah, we need like money laundering and we have to fight against financing of terrorism. That's like putting that aside. When you talk about the supervisory models, I am a big fan of the idea that not now, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in a year or 2 or 5, but ultimately, right, technology is a capable solution for these questions. It's not now, but we have, as an industry, we also have to be honest. Most things we see nowadays is not fully decentralized, right? It's just not. And therefore, regulation is applicable. And I really like the approach, and I'm very proud of Europe and the European approach with MiCA. You can think about MiCA whatever you want. And so we are in 2023. It's not happening that we don't have any regulation. That's not happening. We have to have a sensible regulation which protects consumers, but it is also liberal enough and provides our entrepreneurs the ability to get licensed and then to provide the products and services. So I think you need that understanding first, and then you hopefully come up with good regulation. To give you another idea, if you would prefer using existing regulation, that really depends. For example, for issuance of a digital security, the prospectus regime was quite good, right? You don't need to change that. But if you set up a DAO and you don't come up with a suitable corporate form kind of thing for a specific subset of the DAOs, you will end up in a situation where the existing, the courts will say, look, this is a group of people aligning with their idea and putting efforts to a certain goal. You're nothing else than a limited partnership. So everybody will be liable for everything you as a group do. And that's an outcome you don't want to have, right? So there you need to change laws. There you need to regulate to avoid an outcome you don't want. But coming back again, right? It is complex in every aspect. We are regulation, we just say that as easily, yeah? And then you might think of, regulation, that's the MiCA thing. No, it's not only MiCA, it's tax laws, corporate laws, it's the supervisory laws, it's the civil laws. Nobody tells you that if you transfer a token from A to B from a civil law perspective, in some jurisdictions, that's not even has any consequences. And then they tell you, we tokenize piece of art, and if you transfer the token, the piece of art, the ownership right is transferred. It's in most cases, it's just not, right? So it is really, again, a process, the same process as maybe with nothing starts fully decentralized, and we will not have a perfect regulatory regime in Europe for all of the questions we have. But we are on a very good way, I have to say, and actually the bridge, the gap between DeFi and regulators, as a chair of the board of INATPA, that is exactly what we do. We try to do that, right? We try to bring the industry in front of the regulator, to talk to them, to learn from each other, and to come up with a good regime.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So I think what we highlighted right now is the different approaches globally. We have state-driven regulation in China. We have market-driven regulation in the United States, where it's regulation by enforcement, SEC, CFTC, etc. And we have regulation in the European Union in the way of MiCA, the Markets in Crypto Asset Regulation. We have the new AML package, the new DAC8 with taxation coming up. So there is a saying, strategy is to decide what not to do. And this is maybe also where I hand over to Alain to get his views on, do we need a MiCA 2 for decentralized finance? Is there any, or do we say we want the market to develop first and as a European Union need this room for innovation? Or is there different approaches that we can follow on, like, for example, DLT pilot regime or sandbox regimes? Of course, just your personal opinion, not the European Banking Authority's one.
No, and I can give you our opinion actually. First of all, already starting to speak about MiCA 2 is too early. This is like when people started to talk about PSD3, I remember, on open banking before PSD2 was implemented. It's like, no, stop, let's implement it first. MiCA already contemplates somehow a review of MiCA. There's actually, for the end of next year, for December next year, the Commission has to somehow submit a report to both co-legislators, the Parliament and the Council, on 4 topics. 4 topics that were not covered by MiCA on purpose. One is DeFi, the other one is lending, the other one is NFTs, and the other one is, let's say, the relationship between transfers of EMTs and PSD2. And what I can say is that we will contribute to that with some sort of publication. We will organize workshops. We will organize meetings where we will invite industry representatives to there. And then there's, by 2027, the Commission will have to table this MiCA review report where there we will all see the legislative proposals to actually amend MiCA if this is considered necessary. What kind of content we could find in such reports, either next year already? I think we will see in our reports, for example, or in Commission's reports. I would say we care about 3 topics I would group. One is investor and consumer protection. Another one is financial stability risks. And the other one I would say is governance and operational risks. Just to group everything into those 3 buckets. Financial stability risks, in the case of DeFi, we are not, I would say, if you read all the reports from regulators, we are not too concerned. The DeFi market is so far small. There is excessive leverage. There's high collateralization, but because the size of the market is still small, and especially because the market is somehow now dedicated for it's based on institutional investors entering DeFi. For the moment, this is not a big concern. In terms of investor and consumer protection, I mean, as I was saying, there's not too many retail investors in DeFi, we would say. But if they were to enter, we consider that they don't have too much protection as of now. One aspect would be disclosures, explaining better, being more transparent. Another one, I would say, is how oracles work and how we supervise or we do some sort of oversight on that data that is provided from oracles into DeFi on-chain and automated. And I would say that the other one is how retail consumers or investors access DeFi. And most of the providers of this access to DeFi, they could already be regulated under MiCA somehow. They provide CASP services, and that's fine. But I think John mentioned earlier web interfaces that just provide the service, and then the user can somehow do transactions on DeFi from a non-custodial wallet. So therefore, that web interface doesn't fall under MiCA because it's not a CASP. But we could bring those web interfaces within MiCA, extend MiCA. And in terms of governance, and a bit also reacting to the question that you did earlier, I think it's so there's a few challenges. One would be conflicts of interest. I think DeFi, and especially in DAOs, there's many people working for multiple DAOs. There's no control of that. There's no identification of if there is actually any conflict of interest, which may be even harmful for specific DAOs and DeFi protocols, but also for regulators. There's also what we were saying, who is liable. We could somehow bring DAOs into a legal status, and this probably would be beneficial for DAO participants, because somehow the liability they have now, as we saw in some cases in the US, they can be scared. They can be brought into the full liability. So a DAO would protect the individual that participates in a DAO. But this may not solve all the solutions, and this is very complicated, who will be liable. And then in terms of operational risks and governance as well, it's very important for us, and there's already a lot of global regulators looking at this, is the security standards and the, let's say, certifications necessary to deploy smart contracts. there's no sort of control. There's the market of auditing smart contracts is very small. We know that many DeFi protocols claim that they have to wait for 1 year if they want an audit. But maybe if you actually regulate the auditing and you require it, you actually create the market for auditors of smart contracts. And also in terms of security, which includes not only smart contracts, but also the open permissionless blockchains in which they are deployed. And not only the level 1s, but also the level 2s. So I'm not saying how we will regulate all of this, but I think all of these aspects should be in the regulatory discussions.
Thank you, Alain. So we see that in Europe, there's already a lot of thought being put into how we're going to regulate it and how we're going to do that. So maybe next to Jon, who's working globally with for Uniswap in the policy department, speaking to a lot of international regulators from different jurisdictions. And I mean, crypto by design is borderless. It's a borderless phenomenon that is not bound to certain regulation barriers. So what is the approach that you see internationally? Are other jurisdictions or other bigger players following the European Union in their considerations about how should we regulate DeFi, or are they saying, okay, we want the market to develop and thrive based on less regulations, so to say?
So I mean, I think mostly all of us know what the US approach is, which is, of course, a lot of enforcement, some that goes through, some that luckily does not go through. But I think from most of the discussions that we have, whether we are in APAC or you're in the Middle East or you are in the US, you are not able to have the same advanced discussions as you are in the EU because MiCA is coming, and it has been coming for a long time, which definitely leaves Europe a step ahead in terms of thinking differently about DeFi. I mean, just here to Alain's answer before, how am I going to follow up on something that they haven't already thought of? So I think here we can have like a factual discussion about, okay, so what is actually still of DeFi? What is still within MiCA? What do we need something new for? I think if you look at the UK, they're basically doing, well, they have a couple of days left to confirm, but I think they're supposed to publish the outcome of their consultation, which, as far as I know, should say that for DeFi, they are still assessing and trying to figure out exactly what to do, which is basically what MiCA says. There are not 1, but 3 reports about we will continue to monitor. It is not as simple as extending the scope of assets that we cover in a centralized manner. It is completely a different way of looking at regulation. Do we apply it to individuals? Do we certify software within financial services? It's a completely different way of thinking if you want to protect in the same way without hindering the innovation. There is, of course, always the choice to just apply the old regulation, which is some of the enforcement actions we've seen. But I think in Japan, you see the same thing where they're also, so pretty much every jurisdiction, as far as I've seen, they tend to go stable coins, centralized finance, and then decentralized finance. And some places, they make the mistake of trying to do all in one, which means they're held back, and they probably could have had something out there already if they had done just stable coins in the beginning. So I haven't seen a regulatory silver bullet, if you will. I haven't seen a more advanced discussion than the ones that we are able to have in the European Union. And I've seen a lot of mimicking of the European Union framework. Then they take the parts they like about MiCA, they throw away the parts they don't like, or it has to fit with their additional regulation where it might be different than our MiFID or our EMD2 or whatever it is that we have in Europe. But I think for the most part, I think MiCA is a success in that way that I could imagine people looking at the European Union when it comes to DeFi as well. But to Alain's point, I think whenever people ask the question as in when will we have something, when will we have MiCA 2? That's definitely way too early. And the question is, of course, when you're at the European Union is, when is DeFi really big enough to propose anything? Because proposing a framework for, and I don't have the actual number, but I'm guessing like 40 billion in TVL or something like that, it's just not going to happen. So it has to be either a huge influx into DeFi, or we have to have a very big market crash. Or we have the European Union saying, well, MiCA was a success. Why don't we go first when it comes to DeFi and try to shape what you said is a borderless environment So the more we can also as an industry get regulators, not just in international bodies, but in member states and jurisdictions globally, learning from each other, talking to each other, the more innovation you will see, because we don't have to adapt to every country. We can rely that when France, the European Union says something, maybe UK sees it close to the same way.
Max, if you allow me,
Yes.
Jon, I have one question for that.
Yeah.
One of the interesting tools would have been an equivalency provision in MiCA, right? And for those of you who don't know what that is, so we talked about what are others doing and if they look what Europe did, right? And a tool which we could have used is that we say, okay, if another jurisdiction, let's say in the MENA area or in Asia, comes up with a similar level of regulation, it eases then the access to the European Union and vice versa, right? And that's what we want to have as an industry. We want to have an easy access to as big market as somehow possible, right? So we don't have to go through the regulatory hurdles in Europe, at least with one member state, and then we have the 450 million and 23 million businesses, which is amazing, right? But like just add Asia, add MENA in a very easy way. And obviously, the equivalence provisions are not in MiCA, so this is, for me, it's actually a missed chance, because the discussion you have in other, like in other countries, even if you propose that it makes a lot of sense to use MiCA as a blueprint, like the cherry on top is missing. Do you have any idea why this is the case? If you want to ask?
I can't speak from a European Commission point of view
Sure.
anymore, but I think you have to remember that at the time when it started, which is all the way back before 2019, there was simply nothing comparable. And the functioning of equivalence rules was in some regulations being questioned. So I think now I'm with you. I agree that right now as an industry participant, that like any kind of regulation that would kind of invite others to make it similar. So you have, okay, if you make it the same way that the MiCA rules apply, we will then give you access or an easier access. I think back then the thinking was that, well, the more we can onboard, the more we can make people set up something in Europe, the more we can kind of control it. And since there's nothing that we can kind of mirror or compare it to, I mean, you had the Maltese, you had the French frameworks, which was serving as inspiration, but there was nothing really across or outside of the EU.
Liechtenstein.
Sure. There's a token framework. That's true. No, but I think I agree with you. I think, but again, as Alain said, there's 18 months, and then you'll have a review, and it's not bound by the 4 topics. There will be several. There will be a 24 and a 48, like an actual review clause for everything. So this might come up, and I think at that time, I think we'll probably have something that is more comparable. And you also have to consider, we would have to see how well are people taking for example, the stablecoin recommendations from the FSB. Are they being implemented in a similar way? Do we want that equivalence, or do we want to protect European consumers? But I tend to agree with you that it could have been something that would be more future-proof, I would say.
I think this is something we see on an international level in general. So right now in the European Union, we have this process of developing regulation in the space, but this regulation to be adopted takes quite a long time, right? We started back in 2018, finished 4.5 years later. So in the US right now, there are rumors that there is something being negotiated on stablecoins until the end of the year. So that's going to be interesting to see. We have law by enforcement, regulation by enforcement, where the SEC takes action, is really fast and efficient, so to say. But there's never legal certainty if this decision by SEC even holds up in front of the courts. So it's something we saw with Grayscale. It's exciting to see what happens with the Bitcoin ETF now with BlackRock, which pushed the market in the past couple of days because of fake news last week. So yes, talking about regulation in the European Union, talking about the different legal approaches in the United States, maybe I hand over to Mark, who as an industry participant now has to look at all these legal frameworks, and as a CEO of a very big company decide, okay, where are we gonna place? Where are we gonna do business? What's for us as a company the perfect concept, so to say?
Yeah, homogeny, I think, would be the exactly what the other guests were speaking about. The challenge that we really have had over the last over the course of Bancor's development is that in the very beginning, before there was any sort of regulatory climate at all around cryptocurrency, the idea of having a decentralized exchange or even the idea of decentralized finance, those terms hadn't been coined yet. This was just an exchange. And the fact that it was using a blockchain was neither here nor there. And I think that in a way, I kind of wish that would enter back into the discussion, because we're kind of, I feel like we lose some perspective by pretending that because something's on a blockchain, it's kind of other, right? There are some things that you can just call them what they are, and it's perfectly clear. So under that guideline, the idea of setting up a liquidity pool was something that was reserved exclusively for companies, right? For other token projects. This was not a user participation act. And the Swiss government was very clear that this is their view of setting up the exchange on the blockchain at that time. And they don't really mind who swaps tokens on the exchange. It would be really nice if we had that kind of clarity now, right? Like, this is the way that it's going to work. Because, at that time, it was also clear that we had to, block United States IP addresses. And then with the advent of Uniswap, in fact, that was very clearly, an American blockchain company that was offering a very similar service and offering it to the, American public, set a new precedent. And, the approach was still, let's wait and see what regulators do. And when they didn't do anything, it's like, well, I guess it's okay. And that's not a really good way to make decisions, right? It would be really nice if they just said, this is okay and this is not okay. On the international stage, I would really like it if there was, some sense of consensus, to kill a pun in blockchain. But yeah, it would be really nice if the same rules applied everywhere, or if at least there was some level of syntony as to how these laws are applied, because having to sort of divide up the protocol and use IP blocking services and other things to make sure that we're not, encroaching on what might be considered risky activity in certain jurisdictions and not in others is a nightmare. So yeah, really good if there is like some level of agreement. I'm not sure that we'll get it anytime soon, but that would be the ideal.
Thank you very much. And maybe last but not least, Thomas, maybe give us some inputs on the actual topic of the discussion, bridging the gap between DeFi and regulators. You as the chairman of INATBA, what do you think is the most meaningful way and most effective way that industry players can participate in the policy-making process and really try to work with regulators as well?
I think you answered the question yourself already, maybe almost. No. I think that is exactly what INATBA does. INATBA was initiated back then by the European Commission and to represent the industry in front of the regulator and policymaker. And what you need, and it doesn't, like, it is crucial that we have associations, not only INATBA, there are other associations which represent the industry in a very meaningful way and in the way how the regulators and policymakers are listening to them. So you have to, our industry is very colorful, sometimes very loud, sometimes a little bit special, right? Then you have some people call themselves maxis, they don't need any regulation at all, right? And what I really truly believe is that the work of this association is incredibly crucial, because we, as you said, we need these global approaches, and for that we need this advocacy work of associations. And INATBA is trying to do that on a global scale. We are representing the industry in front of regulators globally to hopefully have an impact and an outcome of good regulation. So if you want to talk to Max, or you want to talk to me, or there is even one of our executive teams, Morgan Stein, is also here. If you want to learn more, please approach us.
Thank you, Thomas. Fostering the public-private partnership, I think, is one of the key cornerstones here, also for the regulators, because we can just learn from each other. Thank you very much for taking your time. Thank you very much for the audience. I hope you enjoyed our panel discussions, and I'll hand over to the next panel. Thank you very much.